Hey there, everybody. This is Jay Frost speaking to you actually from DonorSearch World today, where I am hosting, of course, the Philanthropy Mastermind series. It's really good to have you here with us. And today is a very special day, as you know, because you're here. You know that it's time to discuss the new Giving USA results. And we're going to be talking about that in just a second. But before we do, I want to welcome you all here. And I want to invite you to do what, in fact, a number of people are already doing, which is to say hello and maybe where you're from over in the chat. We would love that. And I want to thank all those who have already started doing so. Thank you, Reed and Patrick and James and Julie and Sammy and Audrey, et cetera, et cetera. I really love to see this engagement today. I know that we're excited about this report, or at least most of us are. And there is a lot to be excited about. We had a preview before we started up today. So there is a lot to think about and to consider. And we have three wonderful people I'm going to introduce to you in a moment to discuss it. We're going to start by after the introductions, looking at some of the content itself, and then having a discussion with you. So we want you to use that chat as a sandbox, a place to play, to say whatever you have to say, but also to use the Q&A throughout. And we'll be monitoring both. Jack and I will be monitoring throughout the conversation today to make sure that your conversational components, your questions, are part of what we discussed today. Now, also, I want to make sure I give a shout out and thanks to, of course, to DonorSearch itself, which has provided a platform for this series going back to 2016. We now have about 575 plus programs in the series, including a number of these annual programs. You can learn all about DonorSearch and about the series over at DonorSearch.net under the resources tab and sign up for more on this series. We won't be talking about DonorSearch today, however, so you can only learn about that over on the website, but do stick around. We want you to be a part of this conversation. And for that, I want to invite our panelists to join me on the virtual stage so I can introduce each of them. I'm really, really happy to have these three folks to share information and share their insights on this year's report. And I'll start in reverse alphabetical order with Rasheeda Childress, who is the senior editor at the Chronicle of Philanthropy. You may know her work. If you don't, I hope you'll start following it, both in print, in virtual media, and maybe on LinkedIn as well. Once again, senior editor at the Chronicle. She's a longtime journalist who's written and edited at a variety of publications, including Associations Now, the Kansas City Star, Higher Education Technology News, Campus Crime, et cetera. Do follow her, again, follow her work. She'll also, I'm sure she and her colleagues will be writing about Giving USA with their own particular insights. And so you want to watch for that coverage. Then we have, of course, our friend Nathan Chappell, Senior Vice President at DonorSearch.AI. His career has taken him from being the founder and CEO at Get Boards, look that up, it's a good historical note, to the Associate Vice Chancellor at UC San Diego, senior VP rather, at City of Hope, and of course, where he is at DonorSearch today. You may also know his work as the author of The Generosity Crisis. If you don't have that on your shelf, you want to get that. And then last, but certainly not least, and first, in fact, in alphabetical order, would be Josh Birkholz. Josh is certainly a person who knows every facet of this field, from his work at BWF, where he's been for almost 20 years, and today is the CEO, to the work he's done in the sector, working within the field, major university settings, working as an advisor to companies, serving on the boards, all the way to even his work as a probably producer. But you'll probably know his work best, in a sense, at least today, as the chair of the Giving USA Foundation. And if it were not for the Giving USA Foundation and the Giving Institute, we would not have all the data we're about to look at. So I'm going to start by inviting Josh to say hello and then share a little bit about this year's report.
Well, thank you so much, Jay, and hi, everyone. It's great to be talking with all of you. It's sort of like a holiday for those of us in this profession. I'm always so impressed by how the sector all comes together, all the companies serving nonprofits. It shows that we believe in the nonprofit sector, we believe it's essential, and we want to do a public service as a group for everybody. And I think this is a good example just on this call. From our leading journal of philanthropy to our report on it, to the Mastermind series, really, I'd say the leading podcast or webinar series, all the stuff, a media outlet. Thank you for this opportunity to join you all, talk with you a little bit as I'm trying to share my screen. There we go. I think we've got it up. I'm going to do a walkthrough of the results, first of all, so that our conversation, we're coming from a baseline. And as hard as inflation's been trying to keep us down, it's just not going to succeed. Philanthropy is resilient. Americans are generous. We see that both in the giving to registered charities that you see through the Giving USA report and through all the many examples of generosity that are even outside of the registered charities that we see in our community. When people care about each other, even when they give a large tip to a server, generosity is a cultural value we share. And I want to start by celebrating some of the generosity that made this report possible. Certainly the research and the writing is done by the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and really that's produced by the Giving USA Foundation, which is the charitable arm of the Giving Institute. Just for a high-level summary, the Giving Institute is basically the association of all the companies that work together to serve the charitable sector. The Giving USA Foundation is the charitable arm, which has existed since the 1950s. Really, our first copy is at the Smithsonian of the Giving USA annual report on philanthropy. But what you see on the screen are the many companies that have donated to make this report possible, with special thanks to our platinum sponsors, of which the sponsor of this event today, DonorSearch, is one of the platinum sponsors of Giving USA. Also, thank you to CCS and the Biederman Group. But you see these companies you're familiar with, companies that we purposefully and intentionally collaborate with each other to further this sector, and for all of you. And those of you at companies or in nonprofits, we know it used to be the joke copying and stealing everything, perhaps from one of the trade associations. But honestly, sometimes that's the highest form of flattery, is how much we really learn from each other and support each other. And I would encourage you, if you're not a subscriber to this, to Giving USA, it's probably one of the most valuable subscriptions you can have. Not only do you get the annual reports, the data, but access to the books, but you get the past data tables, all the special reports. Is a very, very worthwhile subscription. So I would encourage you to go to givingusa.org to subscribe to Giving USA. You won't regret that. And it also helps to defray the costs of the research, in addition to the generous donations of companies like DonorSearch and others. So let's jump right into it. Giving, this is the largest number we've ever set, but the numbers keep going up in the past because of that pesky inflation. Charitable giving in the United States rose in current dollars to $557.16 billion in 2023. Now, in inflation adjusted totals, we look back at last year, which we had reported a lower number, but as we apply inflation and revisions of new data coming in, 2022's current dollars move up to $546.61 billion. So it actually did go up in current dollars, but slightly down in inflation adjusted, about 2% either way on how you're looking at it. And 2021 has, as the data has continued to flow in and inflation adjusted, has moved up into an even stronger place as the record year for philanthropy. 2021 actually came in at $621.29 billion. So it actually, we had revised it up to 500. With inflation, it kept going up. And it was really a remarkable time how the American public stepped forward during the pandemic. We're still on an upward trend, but 2021 being the record year for philanthropy. Now, when we look at the contributing factors, obviously there was big tax legislation in 2017. People on both sides, did that create more wealth that increased philanthropy, or did it cause people at that level of itemizer where that switched to decrease? We obviously had COVID-19, natural disasters, humanitarian crisis, economic factors, including recession, above average rates of inflation for 3 consecutive years, and fears of economic situations that didn't come to fruition, nevertheless affecting charitable choices, changing norms around the transparency of large gifts. Some very large gifts where we're trying to figure out, we saw that in the IRS data, but where is it? And we're learning more and more about that. In disruptions in supply chains, data availability, but the growth in giving, even though we had all these challenges, there's also a lot of positive, but we see giving to be resilient year after year. I like to remind people, this isn't like the stock market where the value goes up or down. This is a number that starts over at zero every year. So that was $557 billion in new gifts that just happened in 2023. So the charitable giving, the shift, a lot of people have noticed this gradual decrease of the giving from individuals and the increase in giving from foundations. Now, we've seen slight increase on bequests and foundations. Here's a 40-year view. If you look back 40 years ago, individuals were 82%. Individuals now 67%. I think this is actually a bit of a shadow of giving being more and more from affluent individuals who are more likely to structure and give through foundations. And I think there's something to be considered about that. Now, foundations have certainly grown. If you look back in 1983, 82%, a portion of those foundations were family foundations, probably 3-4%, and the bequests obviously are individuals that made those choices before they met certain actuarial realities. You might say about 90% of giving decisions were made by individuals in 1983. We would estimate that to be about 84% today. So the choices of philanthropy are largely still individuals, although the mechanisms by which they give are increasingly sophisticated, which is more consistent with larger level donors, which are a larger portion of the share as years have gone on. Now, we've tracked for years, many people are used to Giving USA comparing to the GDP. It's roughly been around 2%. It actually in 2021, it was 2.3% of the GDP was what the philanthropy dollar represented. We're right around that 2% mark. However, it's not as much of the driver of philanthropy as much as just a nice correlation and observation. When we look at the different sources from individuals, foundations, bequests, corporations, every category went up, but it was inflation that made that number not look as exciting. It's the old, if you're going to give $100, you didn't think to give 104 or 108 so that it would be the same gift as the year before. But nevertheless, the giving did go up across the categories. And I realized I was joking before we started that I'm a consultant. I'll say way too many words that are necessary. So I'm going to just give you some of the key points to get into some of the discussion. But the individual giving does reflect uneven economic conditions. So we saw that the giving by individuals grew, foundation as a piece of the pie grew. We did see disposable personal income go up 8.1%, and the market went up 24%. So with consumer spending also going 6%, things were actually really quite good. These are amazing numbers for individuals. But remember, the end of 22, S&P dove way down 29%. So this wasn't quite up to where they were. And when you're going through 4 years of inflation, it's not going the other way. Bread still costs more money. Gas still costs more money. So there's a feeling of economic insecurity, even if within this year those economic levels did go up. So they have not yet exceeded the 2021 levels in inflation-adjusted terms where we've seen that record year. But the foundation for the second consecutive year has crossed the $100 billion mark. Now, foundation, in addition to individuals structuring their philanthropy, is closely related to the stock market because they're investing their assets. So when the market is up, there's more to give. So there is an impact of the markets on giving by foundations. Now, bequests has been going up, and a lot of people are predicting this will go considerably because of the concentration of wealth in the older individuals at a higher degree than we've seen in many points in our history in America. We might be a little bit early for that, but we might be at the beginning points of what might be an increase in the bequest space. So we did see some increase. They've continuously represented 9 to 10% of the total dollars. We do not measure this until those bequests are realized. So we're not capturing who's made the choice to put someone in their will in 2023, but these were the ones that were realized, which is why I say it might be a little bit early for, but nevertheless, there's concentrated wealth in older generations. Now, in corporate giving, we've seen corporate giving going up the last few years. In fact, it's been the fastest growing segment of philanthropy. At the same time, if we compare to the 1980s, back in the 80s, corporations would give about over 2% of their pre-tax profits to charity. Now it's just shy of 1%. It's actually decreased as a share of pre-tax profits, gone up slightly the last year or two. So the portion of their profits that are given charitably are less, but their profits are so much higher, the number has gone up. Some would say there's a broadening view of benevolence also for corporations that are doing social good through environmental initiatives, DEI initiatives, and other things to encourage good work that might not be bottom line oriented. So their view of being good citizens might also be broader. Now, one thing also to point out is many people have said, 40, 50 years ago, everyone gave to religion. Now they're giving to everyone else. And certainly that religion remains the top charitable recipient in the United States. That percent has gone down. However, many experts say the effect of religious people, defined as active people in their mosque, in their synagogue, temple, church, are still a big influence on U.S. philanthropy. Many of the international relief, human services organizations that were part of denominations are now have moved out of those denominations and are in human services and international affairs. So there's faith-based organizations around. So giving to faith-based organizations is still quite strong. Nevertheless, giving to denominations and to the actual church bodies has decreased. The other thing that is of note to many people is for the 2 years in a row, human services has passed education. Now if you round it down to no decimals, you'll see they're both 14%. But education has been in that second spot for many years. In fact, we left them in the order on this chart, but you can see on the chart in 1983, education was 11%, while human services was 6%. Some are questioning, is education decreasing? Actually, education is going quite a bit. Human services is going up more. But that's something we can perhaps talk about a little bit more in the discussion on education, because it was the top recipient this last year. Education, foundations, public society benefit, arts, culture, and humanities are traditionally the segments where we see the most high net worth giving. And those are the segments that grew the most. Education, largely because it includes higher education and academic research, which are very favored by high net worth people trying to solve big problems. Foundations, because they're often structured in their philanthropy, or you think of Warren Buffett giving to the Gates Foundation. That's an example of a very large gift to a foundation. Public society benefit, pass-through organization, which includes the very strong and successful Jewish federations and United Ways, but also is inclusive of the National Donor Advised Funds like Fidelity Charitable, Schwab Charitable, Vanguard, etc., are within the public society benefit. So a lot of the donor advised fund effect. And the arts, culture, and humanities, which traditionally has had an older, wealthier distribution of donors. Those are where we saw double-digit growth and exceeding inflation in those. But really, every segment did go up with even in terms of inflation-adjusted terms, except for religion and international affairs, where we saw declines. Now, people would say, how could giving have gone down in inflation in the sources, but gone up in the recipients? Part of that is a timing issue in terms of gifts made before and after a calendar year. Some of it is also international effect. We're reporting on the gifts coming from U.S. donors and to U.S. charities. Presumably, some gifts to U.S. charities came from international donors. So there's a little bit of unallocation from year to year. So there's different factors that weigh into that. But really, finally, if you look across the board, it was really quite a good year for the recipients of charity, giving in all areas. We consistently see in the conversation that has happened around the country that giving is increasingly something of the wealthy, but a lot of us are fighting really hard for the everyday donor, which seems to be in decline. So I think with that, I am going to stop sharing and hand it back to our fearless leader, Jay Frost.
I don't know. I'm a little bit afraid right now myself to digging into these numbers the way you were sharing it. I know it sometimes can be a little complicated, especially things that seem to overlap in interpretation. Foundations come to mind and DAFs. And I know that's come up in the chat. But before I say anything, I'd love to get reactions, a little bit of reaction from Rasheeda and from Nathan. And Rasheeda, I know that you more than once last year, but I listened to a podcast that you did recently talking about the 2023 numbers. I'm wondering if you have kind of a reaction to some of what you see here versus what you've seen in the past, and specifically last year's numbers.
I think the story this year and last year is really sort of inflation. I mean, people are giving a lot of money, but inflation is really eating into that. And I know that no charity is out there going, let me adjust my numbers last year for inflation. Because no one does it. But when you actually look at the data, like what you're spending money on, and I think, the human services organizations experience this the most. If you're trying to feed people, food is ridiculously expensive. It's so much more, and you notice. But even organizations that don't have necessarily that direct spend, staff salaries are more, just those different kinds of things. And so you had some gains somewhat in terms of actual dollars, but inflation is sort of eating away at that. I also found it, the foundation aspect really interesting, that foundations are getting more money. And I talked to the folks at Candid who survey foundations, and it sounds like this year, those foundations are planning to give out more money. So that's good for organizations out there who are looking to get money from foundations. But again, a lot of it's going to, private foundations, these gifts. And so that means the decisions or the choices about which charities are going to get money are in a fewer and fewer hands. And so it's going to be important. And I know that the Chronicle is going to be writing about this, but it's really important to get more everyday donors. So you're not sort of relying on people who are like, oh, I think you should do this as a charity. And that's really not what you're trying to do. You're trying to do a specific thing. And you get a little bit of creep when there are too many major donors who only want to support one thing, and that's not what your charity wants to do. And I'll pass it on to Nathan if you would like to comment.
Well, yeah, thanks so much, Rasheeda. And Josh, great job distilling all of that. And I definitely am so curious about your thoughts too. And thank you both for bringing up kind of the issues that I think at least kind of surround the idea of inequality and the growth of, inequality or the rise of the mega donors over the years, and the need to, I think, get back to center. Because when we talk about things like inflation, and we talk about, we all feel the effect of that, and the everyday donor definitely feels the effect of that. Nonprofit professionals who often work, in jobs that are, really taxing for less pay feel the effect of it. And it's putting a lot of stress and strain on the sector overall. But I think also that conversation around inflation intimates this idea that philanthropy is about money. And I think getting back to center and getting back to the idea that the root word of philanthropy being for the love of humankind, I think we've got to take another step back even further. So I think in the report overall, like, was I surprised by any of it? No, I actually think, I think there's a ray of optimism in some of it. The decline, inflation adjusted decline 2.1% is much less than the decline last year. I think combined, and I don't know what the adjusted report last year, the decline overall was, because Josh, you said that the number went up pretty significantly, because last year was something like a decline of like 8.4%. This year's 2.1%. So cumulatively, it's like, 10 point whatever, 3% is big. Like, we should all be very concerned about that. But the hopeful pessimist side of me is like, well, 2.1% decline is much better than 8% decline. So maybe we're going in the right trajectory. And if we all continue to ask the tough questions, and we all continue to, ensure that philanthropy, is not just a wealthy person's hobby, but it's something that every person can take part of, and get back to a state of mind where, I grew up, and many people know this, a low income household where we were recipients of charity, but we were also taught the virtues and the responsibility of giving back no matter what we had or didn't have. So that was either through our hands or through our minds or through, a few dollars here and there. And I, maybe that this is the opportunity, right, for us to confront the tough numbers, to collectively say time out. Rasheeda, you've interviewed so many amazing organizations that are beating the odds because they're taking radical approaches to engaging their communities in different ways. And there's a lot to learn from each other. I think the biggest lesson for me is that we can't do things the same way and expect a different result. And it's reports like this, and it's the distillation of the data that really helps us, I think, understand the gravity of the forces and the headwinds, and then reimagine maybe new paths, different paths, that really realign us to the essence of what philanthropy really is.
That's a big part of the conversation we can have today. And before we dive into it, I would like to give Josh a chance to maybe say what surprised him the most.
Yeah, I love what Nathan and Rasheeda talked about, because that's what's been on my mind as well. A lot of the wealthy affluent donors having a larger piece. And most of us, where our concerns are is control. Like, we're happy that they're giving. I mean, if you think of it, if you have billions of dollars, would you rather buy I don't know, a yacht or a plane or spend it in Las Vegas or give it to charity? Like, most of us would agree that that's a good thing. And if we look at the humanity, I mean, we all want to be happy. We all want to do something significant and have purpose. And we're one of the few sectors that can provide purpose and significance to the wealthy population. I think the real crux of the conversation is, how does that move into control? Because I think that's where the real risk is significance versus control. And I find by offering significance and credit and wonderful donor experience management, oftentimes that can stave off some of that control. But I also know that the person giving $50, the $100 in the community, are just helping their neighbor, you know, with their yard when they walk for the weekend or whatever it might be. Like, this generosity, we also want to be happy. We want to have purpose and significance. But I think the charitable sector has focused so much on the high net worth. Our messaging shows the impact that can be given through large gifts. We might be missing out on the it's better to give than to receive. The giving feels good. This is what people like us do, and building communities around giving, which might be an opportunity for us to turn some of those trends on the base of support.
Rasheeda, I know Nathan was name checking you on this, and you've talked to lots of organizations in your work. You're doing it all the time. Do you have thoughts on this? And maybe even as it relates to some of what Josh was talking about with the kind of the big donors versus the person who has $50 to give, and especially in relation to inflation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key is, for a lot of organizations that we've been talking to, it's really to make time for the small donor and not to sort of overlook what that person is bringing. I mean, I think people gravitate towards the big donor in part because it's kind of easy, because, you know, talking to a bunch of small donors or going out and doing all the small donor things, either with volunteers or direct mail or whatnot, that just takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort. And then the dollar value that you get is not going to be the same as necessarily a big gift. But in order sort of to create, you know, increase that pipeline, that's what people have to do. And I talked with a woman who has a, you know, giving program, and, you know, she's like, you know, if it's a $10 gift, you know, you have to give them that same sort of thank you. You have to be like, it's okay that it's just a $10 gift. Or even talking to groups of people who are doing sort of that peer-to-peer fundraising. And if somebody wants to give you $100 as a peer-to-peer fundraiser, that's great. She says, you know, just reminding them that this is about, you know, helping our organization, and we're happy with any gift, and to actually mean that. And, you know, not the next day to be like, we need another $50, you know, to really steward those people and thank them for the gift that they have and sort of bring them into your fold. So I think that's some of the things that people are doing.
I have a question for all of you on this. I'm trying to wrap my hands around wrap my mind around this inflation issue as it relates to the way people spend versus the way people give. And so for donors, if we're asking them as organizations for whether it's $50 or $100 at that peer-to-peer kind of event, and we did the same thing last year and the year before, then I don't know that people would necessarily gravitate to giving more, because inflation has also made things more costly for the nonprofits themselves. Do we have a sense about whether or not, first of all, donors are sensing that with inflation, it's an opportunity to give more in order to be of greater assistance to organizations with higher costs, or not, and whether or not organizations are in fact asking people to give a little more than they would have asked them to do 2 or 3 years ago when things cost less?
I'm happy to just give a real quick thought on this. I mean, when we look at kind of the macro forces, you know, while inflation is increasing, it's also putting increased demand on nonprofit services. So there's this like double, you know, whammy where it's like you're working at a nonprofit, the demand for your services increase, but people feel like they have less money. And I'd be curious. One of the things about this report, which is always so interesting because it produces data on both, you know, current dollars and inflation adjusted dollars. I know, you know, for myself working in a nonprofit, it was all about the inflation adjusted, because like how people feel, you know, how far that dollar is going to be able to go. And I'm just curious, you know, as we're talking about the report and distilling the report, probably Josh, because you, I'm sure, deal with this a lot. And even what you recommend for nonprofits and how they look at the data, distill it down for their organizations. not answering your question directly, Jay, because I want to get into that in another part. But I think when we talk about inflation, I don't know, and it might be that the average reader doesn't even know the difference. So I was wondering if it might be helpful to just describe the differences a little bit, and maybe even from a consulting perspective, because you work with organizations all day and have to like at least directionally provide them guidance of like how to use this data to advance their mission.
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to be honest, I get these questions more from other experts and journalists and consultants around inflation than I actually do from the clients. Now, we all feel inflation. We all know that gas costs more, that buying the loaf of bread costs more. We all know that many of us, we've had layoffs and cuts at our organizations, and we're being asked to raise more with fewer people. That's really hard. And I think the inflation discussion comes up more in that context than actually interpreting the numbers nationally. Like, here's how our organization did. I never hear inflation adjusted at the organization level. I never hear them say, well, in inflation adjusted terms, this is what we raised 2 years ago. Maybe that's because that would set the bar too high, and I need to beat that level, and I'm trying to be generous in that. I think that might be some aspect of it. So there's usually, I think it's helpful for us to know the true context for the national picture. At the organizational level, I don't often see any inflation adjusted reporting, very few. But I think that's a good consideration going into this, as we consider this arms race around campaign. As we've decreased staff, everything is pushing us to just focus at the high net worth donors. As Rasheeda mentioned, it's easier money to get. It's cheaper money in some ways to get. And what does that spell for the sustainability of the whole sector? I think I think it's weighing into that. It keeps pushing us upstream. Firms like ours, we want to help you do a campaign. If you raise the money for the campaign, you're going to be successful. If 20% more people give, it doesn't affect us as much. So we need to step forward and make choices that the everyday donor matters and so forth. So I think part of it's education. The feeling is at the employee level and the fundraiser and how it affects me, the expectations on me, and how we've adapted our program because of it, more so than a baseline on their own numbers. I'm not sure if I answered that question, but I think I answered a different question with class that sounded related.
That was great. I think it's just, because when you look at these numbers, I know for me, when I first started, they're kind of confusing, and which numbers should I pay attention to? Which ones really help me, understand what's going on in my organization, and how do I adjust based on that? And I think the reality for me, inflation adjusted is where the rubber hits the road. And, with that, I think, this is an Arthur Brooks term from his latest book that he wrote with Oprah, but, I'm a hopeful pessimist. I worry about the future, but I also know that, I can wake up every morning and take action and, direct that in a positive way. And I know there are a lot of people that also have that same orientation. So I think knowledge is power. And so when we understand the data, we understand what it means, boots on the ground, it allows us to adjust our strategies, allows us to set realistic goals, and manage that workload. So no, I think I appreciate that, Josh.
Rasheeda, you mentioned another thing in addition to inflation is kind of a big item for you. Foundations. I know Josh presented this, but it probably also bears repeating about the importance of foundations, but also the shifts that have occurred, and particularly whether or not, as people interpret this information, how they should understand the role of individuals with foundations, whether that's DAFs or the construction of new foundations, or the professionalization of existing family foundations. What are your thoughts on some of those issues as people try to unravel this data and then apply it to their daily work in identifying and developing relationships with foundations in support of their missions?
Yeah, one of the things that someone had said to me, one of the food banks I've spoken to, they said, foundations seem to still be like they're almost professional sort of philanthropists. So they still seem to understand our needs and understand what we're saying when we reach out to them. And so I think foundations at this point, for some organizations, they're going to be, helpful in terms of if you make the case and really sort of understanding that. But again, I think, you still have to hit that individual donor base because they're going to be sort of the lion's share of your gifts. But foundations have been getting a lot of money. It showed in the report. We talked to Candid, who also surveys foundations, and they were saying that the foundations got a big boost in 2023, and a lot of them are really optimistic this year, and they want to give out some of that money. So that does sound good. But again, the foundations are like 19% of the dollars given, according to the report. So it's not going to be, the lion's share of what you're getting. A lot of organizations have talked about DAFs recently, and they're going after the donor advised funds. And it's, the report is indicating that high net worth donors are sort of what's going into these DAFs, and they have specific causes. So I think you can look towards DAFs, but again, it's going to be a certain kind of donor, one of those high net worth donors, and it may not be they may not, every nonprofit is not necessarily going to benefit from those DAFs.
Yeah, this issue is complicated again, because I think people are trying to unravel, well, how much of that money is really DAF money? And Josh, can you just revisit that one more time? Those like me who will hear it a second or third time.
So we have some baselines. Since I know that at least all of this audience has subscribed to Giving USA since we've started this, you can go in and find our special report on donor advised funds, which actually does lay this out quite well. And we have a whole chapter in the book, so the printed copy on this topic. I mean, at the time of that special report, the flow through on DAFs was more than 10% of U.S. charities. So it had crossed corporate giving. It was higher than all giving to environment, and I think one other sector combined. So it's a substantial portion. But the other thing that stuck with me is, outside of religion, giving preferences that a person had before they set up the DAF largely stayed the same after. Meaning they're less likely to put their religious giving into their DAF, but the other distribution is largely the same. And actually, we've found that it's sort of like you're more in the giving ecosystem. I'm actually a big fan of the DAF for reasons that are different than others. Many times, if we look at structured giving, life income, and all these things, we're all easy to say why this is better for the donor, while that's better for the donor. And a DAF's been around for 100 years, but it didn't really take off until the last couple decades, because Fidelity and those were like, we can actually make giving easier. We actually took something and made it easier for folks. And to me, reducing friction in charity is not often talked about, but DAFs do reduce some friction for the donor. So I think that's a positive thing. I did want to add one thing on the foundation thing, just because it stuck with me and talking with a lot of other experts, is after crises happened, obviously the pandemic, George Floyd, we've got Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, big crises that have a bump in giving and a shift in donor preferences towards those areas represented by the areas. And then they usually fall back. And that's been consistent with all four of those things that I mentioned. However, to the foundation sector's credit, they've maintained that focus on racial equity and DEI principles in their giving as a high priority, while all the others have pulled back. I find that interesting that that is staying within foundation giving. At least that's the reports I'm seeing. So I'd love to learn more about that. And maybe it is the maturity as philanthropists, as Rasheeda was mentioning. That's kind of a cool trend that might be hiding in the shadows.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we don't have somebody from Candid here. We'll have to do that in the future to get their report on it. But do either of you have thoughts on this, whether they're anecdotal or statistical, on whether or not the foundations are keeping a promise in a way that maybe the corporate sector has not, or the way individual donors may have, gone from thing to thing?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for Josh and Rasheeda, but I mean, obviously the big difference there is that foundations are legally bound to actually disperse funds, whereas corporations don't. I mean, the rise in corporate giving or decline in corporate givings remain relatively flat. I mean, we talk about a 1% variance over like lots of years. The challenge there is that corporate giving is extremely fickle. Like in boom years, it does well, and in bust years, it does poorly. Whereas foundation giving, I mean, they're still legally bound to disperse 5% of their corpus. So that provides a little bit more assurance, I think, for many, that you at least there's something that's going to continue through thick and thin. I don't know if Josh or Rasheeda have any other data that says otherwise.
I don't have strong data, but I think that's well said. I mean, some people would like to say that corporate giving is the most selfish giving. I'll let you interpret that. I think there's a lot of selfless giving from companies, and I know many of examples. But oftentimes, a lot of corporate giving does. This university's hired students, or I'm benefiting from the research from this organization, or this helps lift our brand, our giving back to the community. And so perhaps there's a following on what are the trends that make us look good at any moment. Now, I'm not saying that for all. I want to be clear on that, but there's probably more of that in corporate giving than other sectors, where foundations, as you said, not only are they fixed in giving, they set guidelines which don't change quickly. So I think maybe in 2020, when we started to see certain expectations, they've stuck around in foundations. Individuals, on the other hand, that's the tricky one, because they seem to always revert back to their charitable interests before some moment of pain happens. I did notice in the beginning of the pandemic, giving to the arts really dropped. We were meeting together, and I was among the theorists that thought it was like Maslow's hierarchy. When times are tough, you want food, shelter, essential needs. When times are good, self-actualization, innovation, the arts, and so forth. And I had relegated the arts as a self-actualization aspect of Maslow's hierarchy. But I think we realized once it was taken away from us, that ability to connect as humans with each other, to understand the human condition and really what it means to reflect on how we can be better people, which is so often present in the arts, we realized that's actually an essential need. That's why we saw a bounce back, was it 27% in giving to the arts in 2021, and we're continually seeing increase in giving to the arts. I find that very interesting, because maybe there was a fickle, when times are good, I give to the arts, but now that I don't have it, I can't go see it. Wow, I missed that. I might be biased. I'm a big arts fan personally, so.
And Rasheeda, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this before we move on to another topic. I want to make sure there's space for you to reflect as well.
Yeah, no, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. I know that one of the things that I was reading about just yesterday has to do with something that would be in the fundraising effectiveness project data, which is different from this data we're discussing today. But they were talking about retention rates. And that has to do, that does dovetail with some of our discussion about whether or not that trigger for generosity is something that we can help to continually fire and to grow. And then it would be reflected after the fact in some of these results. And Jen Benka, who is the former head of, I believe, the American, what is it, the Major Poetry Society, I'm forgetting the name right now, was reflecting on some literary organizations which had seen a tremendous growth during this period, Josh, what you're talking about, new donors, but then had only been able to retain, I think it was 1 out of 4. But then when I went and looked at the fundraising effectiveness project data, what we're seeing right now, retention rates are actually 1 out of 5. So the literary organizations, which were having a tough time, were having actually a little bit better time than the others. So I wonder if there's maybe something that we're seeing organizations doing, changing their behaviors so they can be more appealing to donors who have been there for the long haul, who are ready to invest in different ways, whether they're foundations or individuals who have been there despite inflationary trends. Are we seeing anything behind these numbers in terms of nonprofit activity, which is helping to continue to drive philanthropy? Nathan, you want to take a stab at that?
Oh, I was going to try to go last on that one.
You can.
I mean, this is such a hot button for me. Obviously, I mean, it's like where my eye twitches a little bit when I think about our complacency with abysmal retention rates in our sector. I mean, there's no private industry that would be okay with 19 to 21% retention rate for newly acquired customer. I mean, we're satisfied with, or not satisfied. We kind of see overall retention rates around 40% ish, and that's just not okay. I mean, I think what I've I've come to realize over the last couple of years. I mean, I've been a big fan of Giving USA because I think the data is so helpful in helping me kind of think through some of these theories. But when I've been on this kind of road show talking with lots of nonprofit professionals since my book came out, I think it's become very clear that one of the main reasons I think that we have really poor retention rate is that our incentives in how nonprofits and nonprofit fundraisers are evaluated is broken. And I've come to realize that, retention rate is not a fundraising issue, it's an organizational issue. And we've talked to a lot of leaders who resonate with this, and they reflect on this, and they're like, I totally agree with this idea that, our incentives right now are just about filling that leaky bucket, not on retaining people and pouring into relationships. And they know it's broken, yet their boards come every month or every quarter and they evaluate them based on revenue and expenses. So it's this pretty vicious cycle on this hamster wheel that we're on. And I honestly, I'm hopeful about this. I know it sounds negative, but I'm actually hopeful because I think we're asking the tougher questions now than I've ever seen in my career. Like, I don't know if Rasheeda and Josh would agree if there's more of this awareness. I think Chronicle's really contributed to a lot of this as well, is that 20 years of my career, I don't remember having these conversations at the level that we are now. So I feel like we're recognizing that this is broken. It's reflective in the data, right? Because we're just seeing this transactional nature, especially in the FEP data, where it's just, boots on the ground, where things are materializing or not. And that we've got to fix the fundamental issue. We've got to build incentives within the nonprofit construct that incentivize pouring into relationships. So it's not just like get a gift, move on to the next person. It's get a gift, deepen, create engagement opportunities and strategies that deepen that relationship, that they'll be with us. And it shouldn't seem foreign to us because we are consumers as well as donors. And we understand when brands invest in us as consumers in some ways, that because they want to maintain that relationship. Nonprofits have a great advantage. Well, I totally agree, Josh. Like, people are seeking community in deeper and more visceral ways than in a long time, probably. And nonprofits are inherently built to bring community. Like, Nike can pretend they're going to build a community, and display the effect of it. But nonprofits actually hold this special card that we represent community. And gosh, like, how powerful is that if we get back to, that opportunity?
Yeah, and I would just add, when we've talked to people, one of the things that they say helps bring people back or helps keep people in the loop is having this sense of community, something, whether it's a giving circle, whether it's volunteering at your organization, but people feeling like they're making a difference. For organizations like arts that Josh was just talking about, having people come and get like a backstage view or come see the museum when it's closed, and really just talking to them sort of about what's there. So people really feel more connected. And I think the other thing that we've also found when talking to organizations and our reporting is, we're talking about donor retention. That also can kind of loosely tie to staff retention. When the people who are starting it with your donors just are gone in 6 months, and there's not really that transition or continuity, you're not going to keep those donors either, just like you didn't keep that staff. And if your person who is your fundraiser is there, and those people they're coming in, those $5-10 donations aren't going to pay off for 5 years, but their sort of own professional plan is to leave in 2.5 to go to some major gifts department. Those two just don't connect, and it doesn't work out for your organization. And so really sort of having a way to have some continuity, even if you have some staff turnover, is very helpful for an organization, so that those donors don't just get lost or forgot about, especially the small dollar donors. And the only other thing I would say is donors don't work on the fiscal year timeline. And so if a donor gives this year and they're like, oh, that's just not sort of how they're giving. They're giving based on sort of their own connection with the organization. So just because they haven't given in a year doesn't mean that they're not your donor anymore. It doesn't mean that they don't care about the organization. So I think also having a way to keep that continuity for donors who maybe just cannot give at the moment, but when they get sort of a stable employment or a stable spot in their career, they are going to be able to give you a lot. Being able to keep in touch with those people is very helpful.
I love that last point, Rasheeda. I don't think about that enough, and I think you've helped me think about it differently. Is our periodicity the same as the donor's periodicity? And maybe this annual measure is not fair, but one thing I do want to add to it, because I just love this discussion so much, is for many years, donor relations was thank you letters and reports. Now we're starting to see, like companies, as Nathan mentioned, in terms of customer relationship management and how important that is to them. You hear about customer journey orchestration, I guess the big buzzword you hear at a lot of companies and so forth. But there's real investment into donor experience now. What is it like to be a donor here? From the aspects we mentioned in terms of community and so forth, sort of the old customer delight, which has another resurgent, maybe with Unreasonable Hospitality by Will Guidara and others, where what does it mean to go over and above for that customer? And I did want to just say one quick thing to acknowledge FEP. They're such an important partner. Giving USA doesn't track the donor counts, but we reference FEP's tracking the donor counts quite frequently. They're a wonderful contribution by AFP to this marketplace in terms of capturing what is the everyday donor and the everyday charity doing, which can sometimes be lost in these big numbers. There's haves and have-nots in the donor community, but there also is in the charities. And sometimes you look at your sector, like we were down 12%. How is my segment going up? And we do try to capture those stories well in the writing, but partnerships with others researching different avenues on this topic are really key for getting the full picture. So thanks to the FEP team, which I know Nathan is also very involved with, and I've enjoyed having conversations with them as well. Thanks to that group for what they're also doing for the industry.
Before we go any further, and I really love all of your comments, and so does everyone who's with us live, a lot of people commenting on it. I want to make sure that we answered a couple housekeeping items, which are that, first of all, yes, a recording of this is being made, and you will be receiving an email with a link to it, so you can be on the lookout for that. In terms of the report and the slides, I would suggest that if you can make the investment, that you make the investment in a subscription to Giving USA, which I think we've all done, is not institutionally as well as personally. It really is a worthwhile investment, but do at least investigate that. And if that's difficult for you, because we're talking about nonprofits investments, and sometimes those are hard, you'll find that there's good coverage of this at the Chronicle of Philanthropy, but also in other venues where you can get access to more of this content. But do be on the lookout in the next 48 hours for an email with a link to all this content. I also want to acknowledge a couple of questions that came in. And before I do, I know that when we get to the hour point, some of you may be leaving. So I want to take a moment to ask each of you, if people want to learn more about your work, how can they follow you or learn more about what you're doing outside of this webinar today? We'll just start with Josh. How can people learn more about your work?
Absolutely. So I'm nearing the end of my role as chair of the board of Giving USA. I'm still immediate past chair, which everyone says is the best job on a board, is to be the immediate past chair. But you can find quite a bit through givingusa.org, the same place for the subscriptions. I am CEO of BWF, and that's a really good connection point through our website to see what I'm up to and around. I try to be active on LinkedIn. My marketing team says I should post and share more often, so I'm doing my best. So all the grace around there, and I do try to contribute to writing. But I'm really, the Giving Institute and Giving USA means so much to me. I'm very active in that because even though we're all companies, and companies are supposed to be competitors with each other, it's different in this sector. We're looking at these numbers together. How do we move this needle and be competitive, but in ways that we're also super collaborative? So I think through the Giving Institute, Giving USA, BWF is probably the spots you'll find me the most often.
Thank you. Rasheeda?
You'll find me at the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Our website is philanthropy.com. I'm also somewhat active on LinkedIn. I post there occasionally. So that's the best places to find us. And we have a lot of content on breaking news, trends, anything to do with fundraising and philanthropy.
Thank you. Nathan?
Probably, unlike Rasheeda and Josh, I probably get told by the marketing team to post less on LinkedIn. So if you follow me, it comes with a dose of pre-warning. I tend to use that platform a lot, and it's an amazing community. So Nathan Chappell on LinkedIn. Also, very involved with Fundraising.Ai, which is really, I think, the sector's response, very modeled after Giving Institute, Giving USA, of essentially competitors coming together to talk about what are the future implications of using AI responsibly and beneficially for the sector. So Fundraising.Ai, and then of course DonorSearch.net with all the cool stuff that we do.
And the Fundraising.AI meeting is coming up when, Nathan?
October 1st. So our second global summit, October 1st.
Right. And we did have a couple notes and questions, especially from Anne, who had talked about some of the things I think that Rasheeda, you were pointing out in regard to nonprofits and you didn't use the word investment, but I interpret it in a way that's the kind of investment people can make either on the human resource side, but maybe on the technical side, who had said things such as, aren't low retention rates due in part to the relentless push for low overhead, and retention requires state-of-the-art technology and sufficient staffing levels. And as you said, sometimes you lose a staff member, or it may be difficult to invest in staff. But it sounds like all three of you are to some degree making an argument for why organizations need to find a way to invest in these relationships. So do you have thoughts on how important it might be, or for organizations to make that case internally so they can make sure that they're not just addressing this issue of donor retention, but maybe more broadly, that they're engaging with donors, meeting them where they are so that they can grow those relationships over time and they can be really fruitful for the donor and for the organization?
I think we need to change the narrative on ROI in the fundraising sector. The cost to raise $1, actually the officer-centric point of view. Good luck going to a session on metrics and fundraising and have it not just be for the major gift fundraiser. What does it mean to be an ecosystem that raises money? How can we demonstrate the ROI of how this organization raises money? And that's incumbent upon all of us to find ways to really measure that. I like to say I used to have season tickets to the local hockey team. I didn't do that because a season ticket rep called me and said, here, you should be a season ticket holder. I enjoyed the games, the marketing, the select-a-seat. There's people all around, the fan experience that all contributed to that. Similarly, in fundraising, I think we could do a better job organizationally on the fundraising ecosystem, and measuring it and communicating, controlling that narrative, because I think that certainly the return on investment in fundraising is well known for everybody. Money going into this is higher return than almost any other return. Like, look at a hospital, how much money into a program versus how much money into fundraising and what goes back into the operating margin. So that's on us. I realize we're short on time, so I want to give time for Nathan and Rasheeda to comment as well.
Nathan, you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an imperative question as we're looking at the continued, strain, it's okay to say inequality of, and potentially less democratic nature of philanthropy is, more eggs go in fewer baskets. I think it really is an imperative that we reimagine what donor experience looks like. And Josh used that term, like the DXO, the donor experience officer, which is somewhat of a new kind of term. I think it's so important to double down on areas that invest in relationships. And for a lot of organizations I've talked to, it's somewhat freeing too, because that hamster wheel and that rat race I spent 20 years on was just acquire more at any cost with like very, very low yield. When you take this step back and you're like, look, this doesn't really work long term. Like, let's do less, but go deeper. Like, actually, let's find people that will go the distance with us. And it's not about technology. It's a reorientation of what matters for your organization, not just this year, but in future years. And with that, I would only end on this idea that, well, again, the not being a fundraising issue, an organizational issue, if your organization only measures success in annual increments, you'll only focus on annual increments. Like, you'll only focus on what this donor will do today. But I know for the 5% of organizations that have moved on roughly, that's not a scientific number, but when I poll people, 5% of organizations have moved to a 3-year rolling average. It changes the whole perspective of like the freedom to engage in a donor that gave this year. I'm still incentivized to foster a relationship because, my fundraising goal is based on a 3-year rolling average this year, plus the last 2. That is a transformative thing that costs $0 to do, to really reimagine, the incentives that are related to revenue versus relationship. It costs no money to do it. And frankly, but I think has transformational impact.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that some organizations have had a lot of good success in really just having this idea that everything and everyone is sort of part of fundraising. And so it's really important, like, the people who are working with your volunteers, those are going to be a lot of your people who are donating money, and those are going to be some of your strongest supporters. And it's really important that, that there aren't sort of silos within your organization, and that you can kind of make those connections. And help foster that community and those people and get them sort of also into the donor sector.
As we're getting close to the end here, I want to remind everybody not only that that recording is coming your way, but that we have sessions usually on every Tuesday and Thursday, or at least most Tuesdays and Thursdays, as well as the podcast. So you can check all that out. Where this recording will also be over the DonorSearch site at DonorSearch.net under the resources tab. Before we go, I want to harken back to a question that I asked all of you or mentioned to you before we started today. There was someone who was commenting recently about Giving USA saying, "I don't care." It reminded me of the old line from The Fugitive, where they didn't care about the truth. But for all of us here, I think, and probably for most of us in the room, we do care. But maybe a bigger question might be, and a quick one for each of you, why should others care? And how can they take this book and make it work for them? How can they take the Giving USA results and bring it back to the organization, have the kind of conversation which makes next year's report even more amazing?
Okay, I'll go quickly. The book really is amazing. We see the data, we see the presentations like this on the data, but if you've ever paid for the book, this is made by fundraisers for fundraisers. The people on the ERB, which is the editorial review board, the council methodology, we're putting stories by sector that should be relevant to you for all sizes of organizations, encompassing not just registered charity, but the broader view of generosity. Some like to say it's the almanac of fundraising. If you could read one book as a charity or a fundraiser, that's the one to read, because each year it is capturing the trends and the stories. It does matter. Philanthropy is not just an activity and an activity we work in. It's a value, and it's a value that's been consistent in America, has set us apart, which I'm quite proud of, that generosity. And I get nervous when I hear that donor counts are declining. We need to preserve this as a value because it feels good to give. It feels good to help each other. We know it's better for communities. We know nonprofits are essential. And without the work that we all do in this noble profession of philanthropy, some of that wouldn't happen. So it matters, it's urgent, and it's super fun.
I would just say, you have to know where you've been to know where you're going. And I think the report is a good sense of where you've been and can tell you a lot of trends over time. Those 40-year data tables that they have, it's, you can see the share of individual dollars dropping. And so I think it's good to know that sort of what's happening, and you can see foundations growing and kind of get a sense for your own fundraising of where you want to position yourself and what things you want to sort of change and move on with it, and sort of not quite benchmark, but kind of see where you sit in relation to the data. And so I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add other than what Rasheeda and Josh just said. I think so insightful. I believe that apathy is probably one of the biggest risks to humanity. So frankly, the idea of not caring, whether it's about the environment or generosity or a neighbor or a community. So for me, personally, data helps me craft my orientation around those things. I just, it hurts my heart when if I hear someone say they don't care. I'm sure everyone on this call cares. Generosity is a state of mind, not just something you do. You just wake up and you believe that you're part of something bigger and that you can make a difference. And I think that it also, to both Rasheeda and Josh said, it spreads. So we do that, and we share examples of how we can do that. It's not hard, it's fun. We have a biological reaction from it because we're built to do it, all those things. So, that's where there's just so much opportunity there.
Well, one thing is certain, which is that everybody who's been here with us today, everybody watching this afterwards, is a part of that community of people who actually do care. And so whatever numbers we just saw that we were talking about today, it's a reflection of your work. So thank you for that. And my thanks, of course, to Rasheeda, to Nathan, and to Josh for helping to interpret a big mass of material that you definitely want on your desk so you can help interpret it for those who you work with and care about. We'll look forward to discussing this again, of course, next year. But in the meantime, to seeing you hopefully next week at another one of our programs in the Philanthropy Mastermind series. Till then, take care. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it.